Okay, hi, I'm back, and in this segment I first want to go over the manual and where we are in the process of building the SIG Kadet LT-40. And if you notice on page 7 of the manual, 6 and 7, it explains how you assemble the wing, and we've done that except for the installing the servos. And the reason for that is before you install the servo, you need to have your transmitter, your receiver, and your servo all working together so that the servo can be centered in order to install it onto the aircraft. So this segment is going to be about the transmitters, and then future videos are going to talk about the receivers and the servos and so forth. So the next, excuse me, the next thing I'm going to do is explain the transmitters that I've used over the past 12 years of flying RC. And it started out 12 years ago with a Spektrum DX9. It's well worn, as you can see, and I used to, have a death grip on it like this when I first started flying, and I'll talk more about that later as to how to properly hold those in a future video. But this DX7 served me very well for a large number of years. I think probably 6 years. And it's seen a lot of the days, got a lot of dust on it, got some electrician's tape up here to hold the antenna in place where I dropped it one time. But it's worked very well, still works. Battery's probably pretty weak on it, but I don't really use it anymore. So it was pretty good. The next transmitter I bought was a DX6i, and I bought it because I wanted a buddy box. At the time I was an instructor, and I needed a second radio where the DX7 was the master and this was the buddy box. And in comparing these two, I want to point out a couple of things about how the technology of Spektrum radios has progressed. And so the DX7 had a number of switches. They were all labeled as to what they were to do, and so you knew pretty much where each switch was. And when the DX6 came out, it used pretty much the same switch pattern. The DX7 had a few more switches, obviously, and the way to program them were very similar, and so it progressed some. Then came I'll call it almost a revolution in their technology, and Spektrum, or JR actually, put out the JR12X. Okay, the JR12X was at the time, JR and Spektrum are the same company, by the way. Just different brands of the same company. The 12X was a revolution in the programming and the features inside. A lot more switches. The switches still were labeled as to what they did and how they worked. And so this was my mainstay transmitter for the next 6 years. And because I went from the DX7, used this as the DX7 was my main transmitter, DX6 was a buddy box, and actually I flew a couple of airplanes without a buddy box on it. Until I got this. And then the DX12 became my main transmitter until this past Christmas, actually Thanksgiving, when my wife gave me a nice Christmas present, which is the DX9 Black Edition in Thanksgiving of 2014. So the revolution in technology continued, because now this DX9 transmitter can talk to you and send you alerts. Has lots of great features. One of the interesting features that I'm not sure I like, but it still is okay, is the pattern of switches between the DX12 and the DX9 are virtually identical. There are obviously some changes, but they're very, very similar. And however, when they made the DX9, they didn't label them. Each switch is labeled A, B, C, D, and so forth. Whereas this one was labeled, you know, elevator, flat mix, rudder, hold, gear. In other words, the DX12 labeled each one, and in the DX9, they're not labeled, and you have the choice of where you want your gear switch, where you want your ailerons, where you want your mixing and flight modes and anything else you want. So the DX9 is flexible, which is great, but that means if you go to fly somebody else's radio, it's not the same, because they may have put their switches in completely different positions. But that's okay. What I did was the default switch settings of the DX9 mirror the 12X that I had, and so I just left them all the same, and I used the basically default settings that DX9 has, because they're very, very similar to the 12X that I'm used to using. Okay, so those are the main radios that I've used. I have a DX5E. Came with an airplane that I bought one time that came with the radio with sort of had no extra charge. This is not a programmable transmitter. It just has some switches right there in the front that allow you to reverse the servos if you need. But other than that, you know, it runs on 4 AA batteries. I also have a DX4 that I got with the flight simulator program, the Phoenix Flight Simulator, and I use it for the Phoenix Flight Simulator. Actually, I also use the DX6 with the Phoenix Flight Simulator, because the DX6 allows you to adjust the dual rates. In other words, the amount of throw each of the control surfaces have. You can have high rate and a low rate, and rates in between if you want. Whereas the DX4 and DX5 only have a high and a low rate, and that's about it. So this is just the introduction to the technology and the surrounding the transmitters and receivers and servos. And in future videos I'll be covering how you bind them and how the servos work and so forth. So and all that's going to be with the DX9. So thank you, and stay tuned.